Hello, and welcome to this CeraWeek Lyceum Lab session titled Faster, Cost-Effective Renewable Energy Development Through Transition and Leveraging Technology. My name is Mary Quaney. I am Group Chief Executive Officer at Mainstream Renewable Power, and it is my pleasure to speak with you today. So, let us begin. The world is on a once-off transition to sustainability. At the same time, we are in the middle of a fourth industrial revolution. Taken together, they present a profound shift in the global energy economy away from fossil fuels, which is already having geopolitical consequences. Taken together, they will deliver faster, cost-effective renewable energy development through transition and the leveraging of technology. Taken together, they present huge opportunities for companies and investors. Which is why I would like to spend the next 30 minutes or so exploring the reasons for these changes and the consequences for our industry. As Chief Executive of a global developer of wind and solar power plant, these are my reflections on the past decade and on the likely trends in our sector over the coming decade. The energy transition, driven by a global recognition of the risks associated with climate change, is opening new markets to new technologies almost monthly. The fourth industrial revolution, driven by big data and machine learning, is opening new routes for value creation, not just in the energy sector, but it is in our sector that we can see some of its most direct impacts. Take this month's news, for example. Ford Europe has committed to have an electric version of its entire range by 2025 and only electric vehicles by 2030. For many car drivers, that means that their next purchase will by default be an electric vehicle. This, of course, from a company whose founder memorably stated that he would build a car for the great multitude. Just last month, an analyst at Morgan Stanley wrote that we believe the market may be ascribing zero or even negative value for internal combustion engine derived revenues at General Motors and Ford. This once in a century change in the global auto market won't just affect the shareholders of GM and Ford. The transition to EVs isn't just about the energy source that propels the car, it is also about the impact of all the other parts of the fourth industrial revolution. The advent of self-driving, the rise of a host of ancillary services including car sharing and carpooling, through to innovative financing models underpinned by blockchain. Recently, I became a Tesla driver. When I arranged a test drive, the showroom let me take the car on my own. Initially, I assumed that was because of COVID, but no, it was because of technology. The company knew exactly where I was at all times and probably had a readout of my driving style. The merging of technologies and the speed of the rollout of new services really is extraordinary. Think of it this way. If, like me, you part own your car with the manufacturer's finance company, you know that if you default on your car loan, eventually a man in a tow truck will arrive at your house and remove your car. That will involve correspondence, possibly lawyers, and potentially embarrassing questions from your neighbours. In the not too distant future, if you default on your payments for your new EV, that default will be registered somewhere in blockchain, automatically activating the self-drive function in your vehicle, which will take itself back to the showroom you bought it from. We're just over 10 years since the launch of the iPhone. The iPhone demonstrated how innovation could completely transform an industry and how people and society as a whole relate to technology. Within a year of release, Apple had overtaken Nokia in sales and market cap to become the dominant force in mobile phone technology, and as they say, the rest is history. In my sector, renewable energy has reached a similar moment, its iPhone moment. Technology advances and accumulated expertise in construction and deployment of wind and solar energy have come together in a way that has created a true tipping point in the energy industry. 12 years ago, wind and solar power were considered environmentally and ethically desirable, but were still a relatively high cost compared to incumbent fossil fuel generation. But now, renewables have passed the cost tipping point with the fossil fuel family's cheapest option, coal. The effect is that renewables have become the ultimate disruptor in the energy industry, just the way the iPhone did with mobile telephony. Not only do renewables now present a more favourable business case, they are also dramatically changing the way people interact with energy and its sources, especially wind and solar. For wind energy, bigger turbine blades, better and cheaper materials, and better use of data have driven multiple efficiencies, allowing the technology to steadily raise efficiency and cut costs. For solar, huge increases in scale, along with steady improvements in quality control, have pushed prices down at an exponential rate, making it likely that it is already the lowest cost option almost everywhere. As you can see from the image, the cost of electricity from solar PV has fallen almost 90% over the last decade, and that of onshore wind has fallen by 70% over the same period. Both are now outcompeting their fossil and nuclear competition on price. The business model for coal and gas is failing, as ever larger numbers of upstream and downstream projects are now deemed uneconomic, and investors are growing increasingly worried about stranded assets and decommissioning costs. Through initiatives like the EU Green New Deal, we now have frameworks that will underpin the next growth phase for renewables and create the space for companies to turn this energy transition into an advantage. The switch from fixed tariffs to competitive auctions over the last decade has driven huge cost savings within the industry to the significant benefit of the customer. However, as with the iPhone, the next range of customer benefits will come not from continued dramatic cost reduction in the hardware, but from ancillary services such as storage, demand-side management, and increased system flexibility. I mentioned earlier that I am now a Tesla driver. Part of the package is access to data, available on my smartphone, alerting me to optimum times to charge my car, using data from my electricity supplier and the weather forecast. Real-time data points me to available fast chargers, and time of use pricing influences my use of those charging points. It's little wonder that this availability of data has drawn some of the European oil majors and others into the acquisition of companies involved in car charging. In an all-electric world, as an oil company, at what point on the value chain are you extracting rent from your customers? Added to which, the Airbnbs, Ubers, Snapchats of the electricity industry are being born all around us, and these will drive the next wave of innovation and customer choice. Now, I want next to look in a bit more detail at one aspect of the impact of technology on renewable energy and on energy systems. Since emerging as an alternative energy source in the 80s and 90s, renewable energy has overcome many hurdles to bring it where it is today. It is now truly mainstream. I joined mainstream renewable power 12 years ago, and at that time, from a financing perspective, renewable energy was officially an alternative asset class. It was costly to finance and of interest to just a few specialist lenders. Today, there is a wall of capital looking for a route into our markets. Over the last 15 months or so, we closed the largest project financing in the Americas of over $1 billion to fund the construction of the first two phases of our 1.3 gigawatt portfolio in Chile. How did we get there? Renewable energy started as a small, non-polluting alternative to large-scale coal, oil and gas plant. Then it got cheaper and became gigawatt scale. Then it became cost-effective. Then twice as fast to build and the cheapest. But there's one final hurdle. What happens when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine? Can wind and solar power ever supply firm power on their own without battery storage? The simple answer is yes, it can. And yes, it does. The other answer is that the power systems of the future, driven by better use of data and underpinned by machine learning, are more focused on base cost, where renewable power plays to its strengths, and less on base load, which really is a concept of last century's analogue coal-fired power stations. Last year, one interesting commentator on energy systems wrote that COVID had sent us a postcard from the future. And what he meant was that the huge fall in power demand, coupled with the growth in renewable energy, enabled us to look at a future where our power systems were mainly driven by wind and solar energy. He also referred to the growing use of data in the management of those systems. For example, last May, on a holiday weekend, the UK's National Grid issued a warning that the country's power system would be challenged by very low demand. At least one British electricity supplier contacted their customers and offered to pay them to create demand by using appliances at the points of low demand. In the very near future, there will not be the need for that personal contact, as the appliances, alerted by a signal from the power company, will turn themselves on and off to conserve or use electricity. Welcome to the digital power system of the future. Returning to whether wind and solar energy can supply firm power today, the answer is yes, it can. The hybrid power plant of the future supplying firm power is with us today. In 2016, Chile's government auctioned contracts to supply 12.4 terawatt hours of electricity, about 16% of the country's electricity needs. Uniquely, this was an auction that was unsubsidized and technology agnostic. It didn't matter how the electricity was generated, from coal, gas, hydro, wind or solar. What did matter was price. And, most critically, the ability to deliver the electricity as firm power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. Mainstream entered the auction and took on the incumbent fossil fuel generators who could offer new build generation or to supply electricity from their existing facilities. We won 28% of the terawatt hours available in this technology neutral auction for 20-year firm power. We are contracted to deliver 3.4 terawatt hours of firm power each year from wind and solar PV facilities, enough to power almost 1 in every 6 Chilean homes. This graph shows the average daily real-time electricity demand profile that we are contractually obliged to deliver to. At 6 a.m., demand starts to go up with the waking of households and the rush to get to work and school. It first peaks during the day in response to the demand from commerce and industry, Chile's main energy users. There's another surge to be met during the late afternoon and evening as home life resumes in the kitchens and living rooms across the country. So how could wind and solar power be relied upon to deliver to such an exacting demand profile? Our response rested on a strategy of innovation and diversifications. Firstly, we needed a geographically diverse range of generation assets to limit the impact of localized day-to-day weather variations. Mainstream has a multi-gigawatt portfolio of renewable development sites in Chile, stretching from Puerto Montt in the south to Arica in the north. Their locations capitalize on onshore winds from the Pacific, the dry easterlies of the Andes, and intense solar irradiation levels in the Atacama Desert. Then, we identified the most promising microclimates right across Chile, which opened the door to the second enabling factor, the immediate pairing of wind and solar technology with large-scale battery storage to follow in the future. Wind farm designs can be engineered to exploit different wind profiles. Solar power provides a certainty of supply during daylight hours, Atacama region offering some of the best irradiation levels on the planet. It's important to remember that while wind and solar energy supplies are intermittent, they are predictable. We had the benefit of 6 years' worth of scientific data from wind measurement and solar irradiation sensors across our projects. This allowed us to map the wind and solar regimes in seasonal, daily, and hourly detail. We can predict supply scenarios to a 99% certainty. The fourth and final strand was to assemble a portfolio of 7 wind farms and 3 solar PV farms that matched Chile's energy demands down to the hour. Our contracted commitment to supply 3.4 terawatt hours of electricity a year is split into 3 phases. Let's look at the first phase, our Condor portfolio, which will supply 1.4 terawatt hours of electricity through a combination of 3 wind farms and 1 solar PV farm. At Chama Wind Farm in the northern region of Antofagasta, conditions are such that we will regularly generate up to its full capacity of 158 megawatts through the night every night. Measurements showed that our solar PV farm in Rio Escondido in the Atacama Desert would generate close to its full capacity of 145 megawatts between 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. every day. Our Serra Tigre wind farm, also in the north, generates up to 180 megawatts and provides close to full power from mid-afternoon right through to midnight. And while the daily wind profile for our Elena wind farm near the southern city of Los Angeles is far flatter, turbines there produce at a near steady 25 to 40 megawatts over any 24-hour period. Together, these projects mirror our contractual energy supply commitments, very closely reflecting our power purchase agreement demand. Any oversupply generates revenues by spilling into the spot market, and the very few periods of undersupply are topped up from the spot market. In time, these periods of undersupply will be met by storage located on our sites. This may all sound good in theory, but what about in practice? The construction of the power plant has been funded by almost $2 billion of finance that we raised. Working with our lender group, a consortium of 8 international banks, we had to demonstrate a significant degree of certainty in our energy estimates. Our analysis showed that with a 99% certainty, Condor will always be producing the 1.4 terawatt hours per annum demand that matches the profile required under the 20-year power purchase agreement. Of course, not every country has the supply profile of Chile, but bear in mind that we are delivering this contracted power without storage. With storage, the ability of variable generation to provide firm power will increase significantly, opening new markets, reducing the cost of electricity, and hastening the replacement of coal, oil, and gas plant. The second point is this, that our management of power systems with larger and larger amounts of variable generation has gotten better and better. In the early days of wind and solar power, critics of the technologies, who are often incumbent system operators, suggested that beyond a few percentage points penetration on the grid, every megawatt of wind or solar would require identical backup of open cycle gas plant to prevent unplanned outages on the grid. I should add here that I haven't referred to wind and solar power plant as intermittent. They are not, they are variable. Intermittent generation refers to power plants that goes offline unexpectedly, which can cause system operators a real headache, particularly if they lose an entire power station. Variable generation, however, is easily managed, and as can be seen in many markets, has now reached levels of penetration that has required the same system operators to radically review their earlier predictions. In Ireland, for example, my home market, wind supplied an average 37.7% of electricity demand in 2020, compared with 32.4% in 2019. Ireland has 2 interconnectors with our neighbours in Great Britain. Not long after I joined Mainstream 12 years ago, fossil fuels provided 3/4 of Britain's electricity, some 20 times more than renewables. In 2020, the roles had reversed completely, and renewables overtook fossil fuels for the first time to become Britain's biggest source of electricity over the whole year. Together, wind, solar, hydro, and biomass provided 104 terawatt hours of electricity, or 39% of all consumed. And the pace of change really has been dramatic. Renewable output has increased tenfold since 2010, while fossil-fueled output has fallen 60%. In 2020, supply from coal, gas, and oil fell to below 100 terawatt hours for the first time since 1960. Coal power continued to decline at a rapid rate, with 2020 seeing a continuous period of 67 days and 16 hours without the fossil fuel in the mix. This was the longest period that Britain has been without coal since it was first used to generate continuous electricity by Thomas Edison in London way back in 1882. The continued decline of the technology allowed a historic first, with Britain celebrating its first coal-free Christmas. Our focus in the coming decade will not be the generation technology nor its management on the system. Our focus instead, as we build through 50% penetration, is on the grid. In many markets, such as the United States, China, and Europe, wind and solar energy is generated far from load centres and has to be managed across grids designed to convey mine-mouth coal-fired generation or coastal nuclear power to where the customer lives and works. That limits the amount of renewable energy that can be used at times of peak production, leading to curtailment. Today, again due to advances in technology, in this case in high voltage direct current transmission, it is possible to ship large volumes of wind and solar power across long distances with minimal losses. In this aspect of the renewables revolution, China has taken the lead, building thousands of kilometres of HVDC transmission to bring wind power from the rural west to the industrial and commercial east. In Europe, wind generated in the northern seas and solar power from the Mediterranean basin needs to be brought to load centres in mainland Europe and Germany and France. To meet the ambitious targets in Europe's Green New Deal, and for the UK and the European Union to reach their net zero targets by mid-century, we need to be generating very large amounts of wind and solar power, and that power has to come from a distance. We can no longer treat states and countries as individual electricity markets, and that's not confined just to Europe. Only 2 weeks ago, Texas showed us the limitations of an islanded grid. The recent winter storms have highlighted the need for the United States to plan to bring solar power from Nevada and wind power from Iowa to load centres right across the country. A new approach to grid planning is needed to handle the growing share of renewables and to improve the resilience of our power grids against the increasingly volatile climate. This approach should centre on larger, more coordinated, meshed supergrids. Simply put, all the very necessary renewable energy that is planned over the next 30 years will soon overwhelm the current grid systems. This will delay the construction of new renewable projects, costing time and increasing costs. Supergrids would solve the variability problem of renewable energy, as well as improving stability, by connecting renewable energy to a wide range of demand centres. The wasteful curtailment of energy would be put to an end, creating larger, more resilient, carbon-free electricity markets. Supernode, a company co-founded by Mainstream in 2018, is developing innovative cable technology that can efficiently transfer large amounts of power over long distances. Supernode's superconductor cables will enable the transmission of power with zero electrical losses, require significantly less materials and infrastructure, and can carry much larger amounts of power than the copper cables used today. Superconductors can revolutionize grid infrastructure and really are the perfect technology to unlock a zero carbon future. I expect that superconductors will do for electricity what fibre optic cables did for telecommunications by replacing the copper wires. Then the third and final issue that I wanted to explore is the impact of technology in accelerating the flow of investment towards renewable energy and away from fossil fuels. Let's start with coal. Global investment in coal has plummeted by 80% in the past decade alone. For the first time ever, more coal-fired stations are being shut down around the world than are being opened. In 2008, Peabody Energy was the largest privately owned coal company in the world, a blue-chip corporation with 125 years of success. That same year, Fortune magazine called it one of America's most admired companies. Just 8 years later, it had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This shift away from coal is global and will be accelerated by the announcements by China, South Korea, and Japan in late 2020 to move to net zero and away from the financing of new coal plants in other countries. Last year, there was a record $500 billion invested in decarbonisation globally. This was an increase of almost 10% in the year before. According to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, this colossal figure included $300 billion invested in new renewable energy capacity and $140 billion on electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. But we have to do more and we have to go faster. The International Renewable Energy Agency estimates that we need to quadruple the amount of investment in decarbonisation if we are to meet our Paris objectives. And we have to guard against the irrational exuberance that often accompanies such investment surges. Only last month, in the UK's most recent licensing round for offshore wind, the sums bid by winning bidders to obtain an option to lease an area of undeveloped seabed were far in excess of industry expectations. Having said all that, I'm optimistic that as an industry, we are growing the amount of finance required for the transition and bringing new players into our sector, encouraging them down the value chain from investing first in operational projects, then in projects in construction, and then once they are comfortable into taking pre-construction risk. I want to single out the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Back in 2016, they invested in our Lekela power platform, which had as its goal the delivery of 1 gigawatt of renewable energy projects in Africa, a goal that it has delivered, thanks to the backing of a fund that traces its roots right back to the earliest days of the oil industry in the US. This growing investment confidence in the global financial community is reflected in growing political ambition. 9 out of 10 countries on the planet now have renewable energy targets, almost 4 times what it was just 10 years ago. And at the end of last year, almost every country on the planet submitted higher and more ambitious national plans for decarbonisation into the COP process. And they are right to be ambitious, because predictions of future growth in wind and solar energy have historically been very conservative and turned out to be significant underestimates. In 2007, the International Energy Agency forecast that there would be 180 gigawatts of renewables globally by 2024. In 2014, there were 900 gigawatts of wind and solar globally, 5 times the IEA prediction, delivered in half the time. So what's driving this? Is it solely environmental concerns? No, of course, it's the economics as well. Twice as much capital investment is going into wind and solar power globally compared to coal, oil, gas, and nuclear combined. During the 80s, the oil and gas majors took 7 of the top 10 places in the Standard & Poor's 500. The last remaining one, Exxon, dropped out just late last year. In the past 5 years, fossil fuel stocks have underperformed against all other sectors globally. Instead of bolstering portfolio returns, these energy stocks have cost investors billions of dollars over the past 5 years. On the S&P index, they now hold just a niche 5% presence, and since June 2015, 35% has been wiped off their value. The fossil fuel industry is predicted to see between $1 trillion US and $4 trillion in investor assets stranded between now and 2035. The investment community recognizes that these companies will be increasingly risky investments. The fossil fuel industry in all its forms will decline more rapidly than people think, as investors take flight because of the medium and long-term risk to their investment returns. My theme in this presentation is the leveraging of technology to deliver a faster and more cost-effective transition to decarbonisation. The transition in global energy supply and demand, coupled with the technology impact of the fourth industrial revolution, is accelerating way faster than anyone could have predicted a decade ago. Last week, the British naturalist and broadcaster Sir David Attenborough gave a stark warning to diplomats at a specially convened meeting of the United Nations Security Council. What he said was, "Please make no mistake, climate change is the biggest threat to security that modern humans have ever faced. We have left the stable and secure climatic period that gave birth to our civilizations." In 1983, when CeraWeek started, it may be remembered by many here as the height of the US oil price crash. But 2 years earlier, the opening of the Goodnoe Hills wind farm in Washington state, using Boeing wind turbines, marks the start of a technology shift that is transforming the global energy sector. I am optimistic and confident that technology and ambition will enable us to see off the challenges of climate change that David Attenborough described. Instead, we will create a world electrified by renewable energy and deliver a global transition to sustainability. Thank you.